for joining us today to discuss green business and its relation to creating community resilience and building an economy that works for people and planet rather than the other way around, which is the economy we have now. Our goal as Greens is to create an economy which makes it possible for people to live a meaningful life through connecting to each other and the places we live. And tonight we're going to talk to some people who have made inroads into demonstrating that an economy which supports our well-being and empowers folks, as well as the health of our planet, biosphere, and soil could work. And each of these humans runs or participates in a green business that gives us a glimpse of what a green, circular, or even regenerative and definitely equitable economy might look like. As Green Councillor Andy Fewings reminded us in a recent event about participatory democracy a few weeks back, everything we do is in some way political. And that's mainly because of the current economy we live in and the laws and policies which uphold that economy and shape our society, which makes every pound we spend essentially a political act. Because the true cost to people and to planet of the things we buy are hidden behind laws and policies like government subsidies, which often make unhealthy and problematically produced items cheap and healthy and regeneratively or sustainably produced items expensive. So with these Green Living Room events, we want to showcase politics with a small p by inviting people who are living examples of the policies within our Green New Deal to share what they've been doing to contribute to a greener future. So today we're going to explore what the nature of work might look like in an economy which helps foster healthy people, healthy communities, and healthy planets, or one healthy planet at least. And we'll also try to relate it to how participating in democracy and in our communities helps to encourage this type of economy to emerge. And you'll probably also see the theme of collaboration, which has kind of strung itself through a lot of the live events we've been doing. Because to run a green business, it sort of takes a collaborative approach. So to do so, we've invited representatives from two employee-owned businesses, which is Riverford Organic and Chelsea Green Publishing, and a community-led enterprise called Fibreshed, which recently remade its way back to the UK. And we also have a Green Councillor from Stroud, who is here to share some of the ways having a green on local seats helps support this green shift and incite positive change. So welcome everyone. Welcome Guy from Riverford, Margo from Chelsea Green Publishing, who's joining us all the way from Vermont, Deborah from Southeast England Fibreshed, and Simon from Stroud. Can you each please introduce yourselves and share a little bit about the nature of your work, what it means to your life, and how you would like to see work and the economy change? Maybe we'll start with Guy.
Hi everyone. Yeah, so I'm a farmer's son from Devon, and I started growing vegetables on 3 acres next to the house I was born in 33 years ago. Built a business which is really selling veg boxes delivered directly to people's doors throughout the UK, and we work with a cooperative of local growers to do that, and also with growers from abroad. I'm a kind of reluctant capitalist. I mean, I have to acknowledge that it's pretty damn good at finding solutions to certain problems, but often focuses its attention on the wrong problems and generates even more. And really, I find myself really torn. I kind of loathe and love business with equal measure. I loathe it because of its sort of reductionist, inhumane, short-term, its ability to corrupt almost anything that it touches, I'm afraid, and to reduce our, the assumption is that we can reduce all our motivations to sort of greed, which I find really a discredit to all of us. And but the bits I love, it's just flashed up saying my internet connection is unstable, so I hope you can hear me still. But it can be very creative, in finding solutions within business in a way that which I find I can't do through, generally through kind of collaboration. I'm by nature, I'm afraid, quite an autocratic individual, I think. And I love doing what I do. I mean, I feel immensely privileged. And it gives me the ability to sort of shape albeit a very small part of the world, a little bit more in the, to be more like the world that I want to live in. And indeed, I think a lot of other people want to live in. That's a world which is, kinder and has more faith in humanity, that believes that there's perhaps more to be gained from cooperation than competition in many cases. And I really do believe that, most of us are motivated by the desire to contribute, to have a purpose, to contribute to making a better world. And most of us want a degree of autonomy within that, and that seems to work very well within an employee-owned business where people there's more local decision making and more autonomy, and a desire to sort of learn and continue to get better at things. Those are the things, through my years of employing people, and indeed looking at my own motivation, those are the things that motivate people, not money. I mean, money is an appalling motivator, and there's no end of research to sort of back that up. So why we have created a system based on that assumption, it just continues to, well, it defeats me. I just don't understand it. It's just not, I can only put it down to the people that most people just don't have the confidence. And I acknowledge I am an incredibly privileged person, with all those abilities, those opportunities and wealth. But I still think that most people, money is not why they go to work, but certainly not why they stay at work. They want to do the job well, they want to learn, and they want to have some control over their life. And if we can build that into business, we can build better businesses. And, I'm afraid to say, because largely I loathe business, we can shape a better world through business. And at the moment, it's just tearing the world apart in the most corrupting, cynical way. I think I noticed I've been 4 minutes. I think I'll stop there. That's probably quite, I hope everyone knows more or less what Riverford do. We deliver, personally, I do still spend a lot of time in the fields. I've been out picking artichokes this afternoon, and that's where I go to kind of recharge my batteries, and I try and spend as little time in meetings as possible. The meetings I have tend to be in the fields. So 2 people wanted to come and talk to me today, and they have to come and pick artichokes. That's the deal. Yeah, as little time as possible. Anyway, that's enough. 4 minutes, someone else's turn.
Thank you, guys. Margo, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, well, hello, everyone. I'm the head of and co-founder of Chelsea Green Publishing, which is a US-based book publisher. And recently we opened a UK division. So we're both in the UK and the US. We are 100% employee-owned business right now. That's a fairly recent development. We're a mission-driven organization, and we're devoted to, our subject areas are regenerative, sustainable agriculture, organics, local food, natural history, the environment, nutrition, alternative health, and energy politics and green buildings. So we've had this, for most of our history, this very dedicated kind of focus in terms of the kinds of publishing we've been doing, which of course brings us into the ideas that you're talking about today. And, green practices, we've tried to print all our books on recycled paper and use natural-based inks. We are also reluctant capitalists. We're completely, when we started, we didn't know anything about business. There was more or less a journey of the blind leading the blind down the road. And and mainly because we moved to Vermont from New York City, and there was no hope of getting a job. So we had to do something, and that was create a business, a book publisher, which sounded good at the time. Little do we know, it's like having children. Like, you just have no idea how difficult it's gonna be down the road. So anyway, we made our way, we raised some money from family and friends. We kind of, struggled, and almost went out of business numerous times. And sort of that's the way you get educated about business pretty darn fast, or you don't stay in it. So, you know, like a lot of people, I think one's work life is more or less random. You know, you go to school, you fall out of school, you fall into a job, you either hate it or love it or somewhere in between, and then you go on to the next thing, and maybe you work your way up the rung. And then something happens to disrupt all of that, and then you're thrown out again and you have to figure it out. So in our case, going to Vermont sort of changed everything, and we had to figure out what came next. And so we started this publishing company, which, I mean, we're as amazed as anyone that's become successful and kind of put its mark on the world. But it's been a very satisfying journey in that when you publish books, like not very many other things, every book is different, every author is different. In our case, we're working on a very small scale, so we like to consider ourselves a publishing house, right, at the human level scale, where we are in collaboration with authors and all the people that are helping to sort of get the books out into the world. And as I think everyone knows, books have a tremendous ability to change the world unexpectedly. So, you know, I think we can all think of books that changed our lives one way or the other. And so even though it's a very old technology, going back thousands of years, it's really still works. And, you know, you can read an ebook and do all those things, but the real book in your hands is like nothing else. So I feel like, you know, it's definitely been worth it. And you have the ability to see your impact on the wider world. I mean, not just locally, but all around the world. So that also is very satisfying. Let's see, what else? I mean, the journey into employee ownership. So we, as completely uneducated business people who scraped together money from family and friends, and then we got to a point where we said, after 25 years, how are we going to pay them back? There was no, how are we going to do this? So really in business, when you sort of adopt the corporate model, if you don't have a big bank account that has lots of money in it, the only way to cash out your investors is to sell the business. And so that was an incredible dilemma that, you know, kept us from paying back the investors. Not that they were getting a huge return, but they would at least get their money back. And so we found out about something called an ESOP, which is Employee Stock Ownership Plan, which allows you to, it's a very tax advantage way of buying out the investors by basically granting the company to the employees. And there's a lot of sort of complications around that, but that's what we did. And you know, in the thought that it would keep the company in Vermont independent, we wouldn't have to sell it. And you know, that was our solution, and we were able to then pay out the people who had sort of put their money in the business from the beginning. So we did that in 2012. In 2019, we completed the process and became 100% employee owned. And there's more to say about that, but I'll wait. So.
Thank you, Margo. Deborah, do you want to go next?
Yep, so hi, thank you for inviting me. So I'm Deborah. I live and work in rural East Sussex, and I have a small natural dye studio that's dyeing with textiles, not death, in Sussex, under my home here. And I work with natural dyes and fabrics. And really central to my practice is that the dyes and the fabrics that I work with can go back to the soil at the end of the process and do no harm. And at best that I work with fabrics and fibres that are regenerative, so that I work with local wool, for example. So I always try and work locally. And unfortunately, our linen industry has been decimated. So wool is the fabric that we have here, fibre we have. And where possible, I work with wool that's farmed with sheep, that comes from sheep that are farmed in such a way that they don't, it's not just a sustainable model, but a regenerative model. So, for example, at Plough Hatch Farm, where I use a lot of their wool in my dyeing, the sheep are mob graze, which mimics the action of wild animals moving through the landscape. And it really improves soil microbes, soil activity, builds soil, and has an impact on the whole biosphere. So that's really key. If I'm working with fabric, I tend to try and work with vintage linens. There's still quite a lot of them around. And alongside my work as a natural dyer, I'm a founder of both Fibreshed Southeast and Fibreshed UK. And that came about because I've lived all my life in East Sussex and worked here. And I've seen the decimation of the landscape from industrial farming. And then also I studied textiles and fashion and was really horrified by the impact of synthetic fabrics. I just saw the biomimicry, Centre for Biomimicry have just done a chart, and it's sort of like this big flashing moment of like, oh, technological systems have to exist within biological systems. And it's just like, oh my God, I can't believe that's news. Like technological systems will always leak into biological systems. And we know with the microfibers from polyester and all the synthetics that they're absolutely devastating waterways and the oceans. So yeah, it's really important to me that the work that I do, if possible, has a beneficial effect by working with regenerative materials, and at very least it can just go back into the waters here, into the water system without doing any harm. And I say that it's really important because not all natural dyers work with materials that can go back into the water system. And traditionally, sort of in Victorian times particularly, there was a lot of chrome and a lot of tin and a lot of iron was used. And there are also plants that are toxic. So natural dyeing, I'm just putting this in as a caveat because people often go, oh, natural, it's got to be okay and not toxic. That's not the case. But yeah, that's my private practice. I do commissions and I run workshops. And wherever possible, I work with my daughter, who's a farmer, and we work on the land so that we can give people a direct experience of the landscape and how the choices they make about the materials and the way those materials are processed impact the land. And that can be very moving, seeing people really making that connection to start with. And then you asked what work meant to me. When I was faced with a blank page and that question, I just couldn't think. So I asked my partner, and he said, well, you always say to me and our 3 children, actually, what work means to you. And this really resonates with what Guy was saying. It's aligned to your inner values and it gives you meaning. And as well, I was feeling slightly embarrassed because when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, I'm absolutely hopeless at making a distinction between work I'm paid for and work I'm not paid for. What actually drives me is whether it's meaningful and whether I have a passion for it. To my financial detriment, I still live in rented accommodation, and I'm trying to change that model, and I don't think it's necessarily healthy. So in theory, I would like to say that work to me means being paid for the work that I do in recognition of its value. But in terms of the Fibreshed model, we're still looking for funding. It was co-founded by myself, an international knitwear designer who's also a regenerative farmer, and my daughter who's a shepherd and farmer at Plough Hatch Farm. And we're all acting in a volunteer capacity. They as farmers, and Harriet having a very high profile knitwear job, they don't have a lot of time. So it's basically led by me, and I give 1 day a week of my time for free, normally on a Tuesday, to further that project. And yeah, I saw the need, I saw around me the landscape, as I say, being devastated by industrial agriculture, by building, the devaluing of wool. Farmers are now paid as little as 20 pence a kilo for this beautiful resource that we have. And yet we're importing wool from Australia that goes to China to be processed back to Australia and then shipped over here to be marketed, and then from the wholesaler to the shop, you know, and it's half the price of floor hatch because we're exploiting so many resources and people on the way. So in terms of changing how I'd like to see work and the economy change, would be to actually recognise the true value, the true cost, and that's environmental and human, of any material culture that we have, any products that are made, before, during and after. And I actually live on the edge of a field here that sadly isn't an organic field. So they're spraying with nitrogen. You know, and all of us are paying literally millions of pounds in our water bills go towards cleaning the nitrates up from our water supply, and yet that's not costed into our food. And in the same way, you know, the pesticides in our cotton that are causing terrible illnesses and cancers in India, you know, infecting waterways with all sorts of toxins, growing in ways that actually produce, you know, that don't reduce the carbon in the way that they could. I don't understand why we're not doing more. You know, it's just so transparent. You look at these two different models. So yeah, I think that's, I would say that I would want to live in a world where people have right livelihood, and that means that everyone is valued for the contribution that they make.
Thank you, Deborah. Simon, last but not least, our dear Green Councillor from Stroud.
Thank you, yes. I suppose it's probably worth saying that I've been a professional ecologist all my life, really, working from the Arctic to the Antarctic, from flamingos to albatrosses, bats to beavers, wild goats to water voles. And I've seen the natural environment change so dramatically as a result of climate change over my life. And it's quite, both in the Antarctic and in this country. And I worked mainly as an academic, then in conservation. I came to Gloucestershire over 30 years ago to go and work for the Wildfire and Wetlands Trust for Sir Peter Scott. And I'd only been here about a week, and I got involved in a tree campaign in Stroud. This is in 1989. We sat in the trees and we saved them. They're still there today. But as a result of that, a year later, I was asked to stand as a councillor because I was a sort of, you know, active, sort of mouthy person, and I got elected as a Green Councillor. And so I'd gone from, you know, studying to protecting to stopping, and now I was in a position of sort of influence. So I tried to use my role as a councillor to actually make positive change and try and turn the council around and think about what positive thing can we do. And we did start monitoring our carbon emissions in 1996 and did lots of other things. I stepped down from being a councillor for a while in the middle to help look after my children, but got re-elected in 2011. And then in 2015, because of the investment the council had done in energy efficiency in other people's homes, and we knew how much our carbon emissions were, we actually became the first carbon zero local authority in Europe. Which is great progress, but actually sort of it takes a long while to turn a local authority around. And we can talk a bit about green politics and how Greens can affect it later. But in terms of my job and what I do, after working for Wildfire and Wetlands Trust, I worked for a charity who was basically working with mineral companies in Gloucestershire to try and make sure that when they restored gravel pits, they were restored for wildlife. And not just naff, I shouldn't say naff, should I? Not just lakes for anglers to stuff carp to go and catch, which I can't quite understand, but anyway. So we did create some habitats there. So and it's great, you know. I left there about 10 years ago, and this bitterns breeding in one of the reed beds I created about 15 years ago. It's wonderful. But I eventually ended up, I got asked by Dale Vince, the founder of Ecotricity, to work for Ecotricity. And having been somebody who had actually opposed wind farms in the past, I recognised that intensive agriculture and climate change are the two biggest threats to the natural world. And this was an opportunity to use my ecological skills and my environmental background, as it were, to actually sort of make sure that new renewable energy that Ecotricity was building didn't harm bats and birds and wildlife. And I did ask when I was interviewed by the head of planning at the time, you know, I said, look, if I think this is going to be damaging to wildlife, can I say no? And they said, you can say no. You'll have to argue out with Dale. And I spoke to Dale about it, and he said, well, you know, I've asked you to join us because I think you know what you're talking about. So I actually can have a stop on damaging wind farms if they're damaging, and we always try and enhance them when we can. I mean, it's an interesting transferring from working for a charity to a commercial organisation. Although Ecotricity is a mission-driven organisation, it doesn't have shareholders, and so it does put majority or its profits back into new renewable energy or new projects that are more sustainable, be that travel, energy, or food. And I think it's in a way, it's the people who work there, because the wages aren't as high as some of the other energy companies. People do that because they want to. You know, it's a mission-driven, different organisation, and people have fun. It's and it's a real challenge, because mixing those ideals together and actually sort of challenging the ethos. So it's quite fun. And I suppose through working for Ecotricity, I've got involved in all sorts of other things. I've now been involved in. I've got involved in the local economic partnership in Gloucestershire, the LEP, and I actually sit on the business energy group, which is really quite interesting. You know, actually try and help businesses to actually sort of become green. So I'm sort of like coming at it from the inside. And I suppose what would I want work to be? What do I want to work? I mean, part of the reason I moved to Ecotricity was because I could cycle to work. And it's sort of an opportunity to be there, and you're actually working with people who actually believe in doing something. So it's a matter of sort of like a work-life balance, I guess, is one of the opportunities there. I mean, Dale is sort of, some people love him, some people hate him. He's a real Marmite person, and it's really quite interesting working for something like that. But at the same time, I do my council work, so I suppose that's me really. And I suppose how we'd like to change the economy. I think it's so that the economy is actually doing things that actually are positive, and it's not just for money. And it's actually that focus on actually doing something beneficial. And it's one of the things working for Ecotricity, because we take on projects that no other company would take on because the profit margins are so small. It's just Dale wants to do them because it's the right thing to do. And as a professional, it's sometimes really challenging to make them work. I tell you, it's quite an interesting challenge, but I like a challenge. So I think it's a challenge, success, and fun for work if you can do it. And I feel very lucky that I've been able to do that.
Thanks, Simon. So, I mean, we talk a lot about what we need to do differently, and we don't talk a lot about how. And Deborah, you and I had a chat earlier this week talking about how you had brought some designers down from London to Clawhatch before COVID, of course, to learn how to forage for plant dyes and connect to the fibers that they're using at their literal roots, and connect to the farmers and makers who support their work and also who their work supports. And that it was really transformative in terms of connecting folks to multiple aspects of well-being in their work in ways that they hadn't been able to before. How does the Fibreshed system transform work for everyone, or at least for folks who are farmers, makers, or designers, or brands?
Well, as you probably know, the fashion industry is very hierarchical. So you've got the designer at the top, often a sort of big star name. And then even within fashion textile history or conferences you go to, when people are starting to talk about fashion and textiles, even if it's a conference around sustainability, it will start at the point of the mill. And I think people tend to forget, we've had so many synthetics now that people tend to forget it's also an agricultural product. And the Fibreshed movement really wants to take fabric back to, and textiles back to that recognition that we need to work with the soil, that we can't keep having synthetics which come from a carbon source, that we need to go back to working with the soil. So the system is a soil-to-soil system, essentially. And it, instead of being the sort of hierarchical model, there's two elements. One is that we're creating a network. So myself, Harriet and Gala are the co-founders of the Fibreshed. But what we're looking at is creating, I think, quite a kind of, I don't think you can map it very well because it's quite a messy, organic network. It's more like mycelium than any sort of neat diagram you might be able to make. Just finding people who are working, so it can be farmers, it could be horticulturalists who want to grow dye plants, it could be makers, small artisan makers who are making domestic products, could be designers in London who are making sort of high profile, small collections for well-known people. And what it does is it brings all those people together and helps them to understand the life cycle of the product that they're making or the garment that they're making. And it starts with the soil. So in America, Rebecca Burgess, who first came up with the idea, has actually worked with the University of California to establish that if sheep are grazed in a particular way, you can actually embody more carbon in a garment than is produced in its manufacturing in its lifetime. And that's the ultimate goal for us. We're not there yet. We haven't worked with the university. We don't know how much carbon we embody when we work with materials here, but certainly regenerative farming practices where you're mimicking the action of animals moving through the landscape, where they're treading in the manure and increasing all the microbial and fungal activity under the soil, increases the plant growth, and that in turn draws down carbon. So I think from the point of view of the farmer and from all our sakes, in a sense, well, not in a sense, absolutely, for all our sakes, it has the potential to sequester carbon. And, you know, I think people forget how much carbon is actually held in the soil. Simon will be more able to speak to that than me because I'm not a scientist, but there's a lot of talk about carbon sequestration, and it's already a huge amount held in the soil, but all of current farming practices we have regularly release carbon from the soil, and regenerative farming is actually a way of bringing more carbon down and holding it. Wool also is a carbon sink. So once you've got the wool is grown from the sheep eating the grass, which is capturing carbon, which is going into the wool and being held there. So it has a very positive effect on all of our working environments, just as a planet. It's the biosphere. Then in terms of the relationships between people, what would normally happen in a fashion industry, the textile industry, is that somebody producing the cloth would show a bolt of cloth to a designer and then they would buy it off the shelf. What we want to do is to encourage people to actually form relationships. So the focus of the Southeast Fibreshed, given our proximity to London, is to work with young designers who are able to use their influence, and they're young designers who have moved out of the big companies like Chanel or Hermes, horrified by what they saw in terms of their sort of policies of working both with people and the environment, and are now looking at doing things differently and producing capsule collections or just working to commission. They've sort of forsaken the whole sort of, 4, 5, 10 cycles of fashion a year. So we're working predominantly with them at the moment so we can use their influence. And we're getting them to come to the farm and say, how can we work with these sheep? What does this particular wool enable us to make? And if we want to dye it orange, how long will we have to wait for that dye plant? When will it need to be planted and when would it need to be harvested? And so in fact, there is a beautiful dye plant called Coreopsis that's an orange that you can plant that will be ready within the season, that could be used to dye that orange. Or it could be madder, which takes 3 years to grow. And in terms of the sort of weavers, of the spinners, of all the people that are involved, it means they all get a say in this process. They're all equally important. And instead of the designer being at the top and being paid a lot of money, and then often sadly enslaved labour or very exploited people around the globe, we're looking to try and look at what's possible within our own Fibreshed, which is the word that's being used in the same way that a watershed is used to delineate a geographical area that is possible to find all the resources needed to clothe the people within that geographical landscape. And it creates connection and meaning, I think, not just for the people that are making the work. So the designers got so excited when they came to the farm, when they saw the impact that their material choices had. And when they saw how you could dispose of a garment that's made in this way on the compost heap at the end of its life. I mean, that just blew them away, made me realize how far we've come from thinking of clothes as agricultural products, because it shouldn't be shocking, but it was. Yeah, so we can create that relationship both with the designers and the landscape, but also the people who are going to wear the clothes, hopefully, can also connect with the landscape. They can become part of that dialogue and that process and make those decisions.
It's really important. I like to sort of look at regenerative, degenerative, and sustainable. So degenerative is what we have now, we take without giving anything back. Sustainable, we take we give back what we want to take, and regenerative, we give back more than we take. And that can sort of apply as a mindset to not only to fashion, but to food, to every product that comes from the earth, which is basically everything that supports our lives, and also to the way that we treat each other. So that's one of the reasons I love Fibreshed. And Guy, your business relates a lot to this sort of approach as well. You've taken quite a collaborative approach in some ways by sort of sidestepping parts of the problematic areas of our current food system by creating almost a collective of farmers, and then also devolving power and responsibility to be shared with your employees. How has this sort of employee ownership positively impact the nature and focus of your work and the nature and focus of your employees? And how has collaboration with other farmers empowered the farming communities and the citizens they sell to?
Okay, well, I'll start with the farmers because that came before the employee ownership. I mean, I was always, as a farmer, I did sell to supermarkets, and I was absolutely appalled by the way, we were, the abuse, ritualistic abuse that we were expected to take and just come back for more the next day. So it was really, I can say it was Sainsbury's actually that I finally was able to show the finger to in 2001 by virtue of the amount of veg boxes we were selling. And that was, by that time, I had founded a cooperative of 10 local farmers who converted to organic production. And oh my God, we were all just so glad to walk away from that and to sell vegetables directly to people who did care about what they tasted like, how they were grown, who they were grown by, and didn't really care so much about their cosmetic appearance. And, I think, they were still pretty competitively priced, but price wasn't everything. So I think by being able to, just take out the, brutality of the supply chain. I mean, the veg trade is unbelievably brutal. I mean, you can go around what were the main horticultural areas of the, the Vale of Evesham, the mosses around Manchester and Liverpool. The fens have survived, albeit in a pretty brutal way. You go down into Kent and see, all the old fruit growing areas. They're just derelict. There are farms, there are families that are just left on the rubbish heap. And you go to Kent, and all anyone can talk about is property development. It's a pretty depressing scenario, which I would lay fairly and squarely at the feet of the supermarket. So it was with great pleasure that I've been able to, I guess, show that there is a different way, that their kind of reductionist approach to food retailing is not the only way. And it's been great working as collaboratively within a cooperative. We share machinery, labour, and probably most significantly, technical expertise and learning. And I think it's, the farmers have enjoyed that, and having the collaboration and camaraderie and trust, actually. I mean, the levels of trust within our supply chain are phenomenal, through our customers, the way that farmers just put in and they just drop it all off and they just drive away. They don't even bother writing down, what they've delivered, because, they know that we'll treat them fairly and pay them, fairly. There's no, we have a meeting once a year to talk about programs and trust. Anyway, so that's the cooperative, and it's probably singly the thing that I'm most proud of, actually. It did turn my hair prematurely grey 20 years ago when I started it, but it was, I think I might have said earlier that I'm not the most collaborative person. So I love the idea of it. The reality of it for me is a little problematic. And and then it was probably in those early days I was already thinking, you know, I mentioned that I have a difficult relationship with business and, you know, the incredibly short-term nature. I would say the capitalism that we have in this country, in terms of its avaricious, short-term, destructive nature, is probably only second to the US. When I go and visit, you know, mainland Europe, and I do actually have a farm in France, and I visit Denmark quite a lot. I have a close relationship with growers there. Things are very different. People have a much longer term view. They don't have the same economy dominated by the City of London and venture capitalists, which I just think is so destructive. So when I was thinking about succession, and Margo talked a little bit about, you know, what do you do when you've got a, I mean, fortunately, I didn't have any other investors, but other than my ex-wife. But anyway, she was very reasonable about it, fortunately. You know, what do you do? You know, I was feeling the energy kind of running out of me a little bit. I knew I didn't have forever to make a decision, and I wanted the business to continue with the same sort of values and protection of the growers, the environment, the people working within the business, and indeed the customers. And after, you know, I looked at cooperatives, and I couldn't have done that, couldn't have done. So, and the employee ownership was a bit more of a halfway sort of house. And the more I looked into it, the more I liked it. I spent, well, me and a small group within the business spent probably about 15 years researching it before we, you know, finally did it 2 and a bit years ago. And you know, it did involve me taking a quarter of the money that I had been offered by those bloody venture capitalists for the business. But I mean, as I say, anyone who thinks that 20 million quid is going to make them any happier than 5 million quid is a fucking idiot. It's not me that's the idiot for taking 5 quid, it's you. You know, if you really think that extra 15 million quid is going to make you or your kids any happier, you are a moron. And, you know, so to me, I mean, people look at me aghast, you know, why did you effectively give 15 million quid away? I gave it away because I had, you know, total confidence that it wasn't going to make me any happier. You know, I suppose I could have done take the money and invest it in something wonderful, but I don't really believe in that model. I think business is what shapes the world, and it has to be self-sustaining in its entity rather than doing something evil. Making lots of money and then trying to buy a place in heaven in the last few years of your life by developing it. Anyway, Mr. Gates comes to mind. Better move on. And yeah, so we became employee owned 2 years ago. It is, the profits are shared between the staff. The decision making is there's been a lot of coaching. It's not just a change in structure and ownership. It's a change in culture and attitudes. And when we started going into this, it actually rather alarmingly turned out that I was the main problem. So I have been through a pretty intensive coaching to try and deal with, you know, a more collaborative way of doing things, which, you know, I'm 60 now, and it's been a steep learning curve, but one that I've thoroughly enjoyed. So, you know, anyone thinks you can't teach an old dog new tricks, it's rubbish. You can. We can all change, doesn't matter how old we are. And, you know, learning is a lifelong process and one to be cherished, I think. I think the question, you know, how is my attitude to work? It used to be all about me, and it was all an ego thing, and it was all about, fundamentally, having done all this counselling and so on, I realised it was all about trying to prove to my father that I was, you know, a worthwhile individual. He told me on his deathbed that he thought I was all right, actually, so I've been wasting my time. So, but that was what, you know, I think it's very important that leaders, people who find themselves leading in business, politicians, everyone, that they really understand what motivates them, because if you don't understand what motivates you and you are still driven by, you know, most successful entrepreneurs and political leaders are actually mad. They're the most, you know, the most unsuitable people to be leading anyone. You know, they really have serious psychological issues, most of them. In my experience, mostly to do with their fathers. And, you know, you know, it's really important to understand that, because if you understand it, you have some chance of changing it and addressing and avoiding the most damaging actions. So I do think self-knowledge and, you know, coming to terms with your ego is really an important part of running a business. I've probably said enough, haven't I? I better give someone else a chance.
I think what you said was perfect. You summed up all the problems in the world in 5 minutes. That's incredible. Thank you, Guy.
Okay.
Margo, you recently published Rebecca Burgess's book on Fibreshed, and this is the movement that Deborah is representing here in the UK. And you've published a number of books by authors who have undoubtedly influenced the Green Party policies here and abroad. How do you think having an employee-owned business, or even just empowering storytellers who are part of the root of this shift in economy and well-being, and a lot of the sort of spiritual, if you will, or mental, or sort of the all-around shifts that need to occur in our society in order for it to be sustainably changed for something that is regenerative in all senses of the word?
Yeah, well, we need a new story for sure. And I think, you know, because we've been, I mean, we started out with Limits to Growth, not the original one, but, you know, the second and third iteration of it. So it feels like we've been working on this problem a long time in terms of needing a new economic story, and certainly understanding that there are limits, physical limits, in terms of how we live on the earth, and we're inevitably headed for collapse. One might argue that we're in collapse right now, and in fact, this pandemic and the politics that you're seeing right now, the total chaos and breakdown, is a good reflection of that, because somehow people think collapse is going to happen as one event, and, you know, suddenly we won't have food or we won't have this. Like, no, it's like a series of crises that escalate that, you know, Donella Meadows said, you know, human beings just will not have the capacity to deal with this series of escalating crises. And you know, we just don't know how to work well with complexity to begin with. And her book, Thinking in Systems, was all about that. Like, you have to look at it as a system, and you have to understand why linear solutions, when you apply them, may come back and bite us, right? Because they lead to the exact opposite of what you think is going to happen, should happen. And this is reflected in society, in politics, in medicine, in our agricultural systems. It's a incredibly stupid, linear thinking that doesn't understand how the earth operates, how nature operates. They don't understand the basis of natural systems. So there's concepts like GMO foods, like if we change this gene, it's going to change that outcome. Wrong, you know, wrong. It's just like completely wrong. So we need new stories. And, you know, Kate Rayworth talked about donut economics. We published her in the US. Circular economy, biomimicry, all these things, bringing the economy back to the local level, what Fibreshed is doing. I mean, these are incredibly important things. You know, cutting out the middlemen, the grocery stores. They're not needed. There's so much sort of excess middlemen in this system. Everyone who's extracting a piece of the profit, but who don't need to be there at all. So I do think that telling those news stories is incredibly important. In terms of employee ownership, there's two things to say about it. One is that I think the educational system has done a great disservice to everyone and to our young people. We are not encouraged to think about work in a creative way. We're not encouraged, you know, you go to school and you think you're going to come out and have a profession, make lots of money. Wrong, you know, wrong. Like, it's not how you can make yourself happy or anything else. I mean, you may make a lot of money, but it's not going to lead to a meaningful life. So, and I think, so that's part of the problem, and I think we really have to rethink what education means. Education should, you know, might mean apprenticeships. It might mean getting your hands dirty. It might mean making things, real things, material things, where, you know, you contribute at a community level, and you're connected to the rest of the community. These are really important concepts that we've just totally gotten divorced at, and technology, of course, hasn't helped at all in that sense. And here we all are on a Zoom call, so I guess there's something to be said for it. But I actually personally can't wait till we have live events again, where we can see each other in the flesh and, you know, get back to what makes us human. It's like, this is ridiculous, this whole, you know, and I can see the technologists, thank you, you know, Bill Gates and others, who are lining up to make sure this is our future. This is our future. We're not going to have human-to-human contact anymore. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on that's not so great. So the other part of employee ownerships that we're still grappling with, and you know, as Guy said, people who are bosses want to remain being bosses. That's sort of, you know, so it's hard to overcome that instinct. But it's also hard on the other side for people who think of themselves as employees to think of themselves as owners. And we come up against this all the time. People love to take credit for the good things and sort of you know, get rewarded for the get rewards, right, when it goes well. They're less you know, anxious to take responsibility for when things go wrong. And I think as an owner, you know, if you own a business, the buck stops there. You have to, like, you've got to solve it one way or the other, right? And it may not be to the liking of everyone else. People may have to be laid off or whatever it is, whatever that comes up. But I think it's very hard for people who think of themselves as employees and therefore deserving of everything they can get, versus when it gets tough to kind of come up with and sort of remain committed to solving the problem. And so that's an ongoing process that we're grappling with right now in terms of how do you instill that ownership culture, which is different from just being an employee, where you take your paycheck and you go home at the end of the day. You know?
Can I come back on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I was absolutely expecting that to be the case, particularly with managers, actually particularly with middle managers. I was told those are the ones who would hang on to their power most stubbornly. I've been astounded. I think we've, you know, and I was told that we would lose lots of people. I think we've lost one person I could identify that really just couldn't deal with the cultural change as a manager. But I've just been blown away both by the responsibility of the then staff, now co-owners, and how, you know, they have taken responsibility. The staff council is a co-owner council, sorry, is you know, an absolute hotbed of new ideas and advice, you know, and actually the board thought that this was going to be cumbersome and, you know, they were going to be drowning in consultation, and absolutely it's where we go for advice. I mean, it's been incredible. And I do think there is a thing with all managers, a key part of management, I think, is knowing when to get the hell out of the way, and that probably remains to be the case, but I think people have got better at it. So, I mean, it's absolutely, you know, blown me away and massively increased my faith in humanity, really, and you know, led me to the conclusion that people aren't the problem. It's the bloody systems and the businesses and the government. You know, people are basically good and will do the right thing given a half a chance.
That's
so
good.
I just wanted to say that that's been our experience.
Well, that's good to hear, because I mean, I remain optimistic too, but I'm just saying it's more of a process than I thought it might be, and it may be because we're so small too. You know, we only have like under 25 employees, so it's on top of everything else we have to do. I think it's a sense, do we ever get around to that aspect? So
yeah, well, we took a long time doing it, and we did put a lot of resource into it. I mean, people director. She was absolutely fantastic, and she kind of put me off until she was ready to do it, and then she said, "Come on, guy, now's the time." And we spent 3 years doing it. We took on a coach, we took on a learning and development manager, and you know, if it had been left to me, it would have been a disaster. But it actually worked out.
Well, maybe that's my problem.
Well, I could give you the name of a really good coach. I'm not sure it would work on Zoom.
Yeah, but I do think employee ownership is a model that needs to be much more widely available. I mean, capital is totally tied up, you know, in owners and investors. And, you know, if you don't give people a stake in the business, why should they care at all, really? So I do think that there needs to be a lot more education about the options available for employee ownership. That employees, when they hear their company is closing or something, need to know that they, you know, it's possible that maybe they could take over the ownership or figure out a way to buy the company or, you know, take it on. And yeah, and I think people in general, just in terms of the education, need to be, understand that it's, that their work is in their hands. They should be able to, they're not all victims, in other words, that, you know, it's not just, I have to get a job to survive, but they can create their own jobs. They can, even on the smallest scale, create a little business and be self-sufficient. So I think there needs to be a lot more education along those lines.
Definitely. And experimentation, perhaps, and nuance and so on. Yeah. Simon, I wanted to ask, and we're running a little bit over, so I'm just wondering if everyone can give me a thumbs up if they can go maybe 10 more minutes. Are you good? Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So Simon, I wanted to sort of bring you in here because I want to talk about how Stroud is sort of a hot spot for green business. You have the first organic cafe in Britain. You have Stroud Micro Dairy, which I think is the first regenerative ethical dairy in Britain. And you have more than one deep green renewable energy company, Good Energy and Ecotricity, who you've also shared already. As a councillor and as a citizen, how does having a green on the council help expedite investment in areas like green business or even experimentation like we're talking about that sort of supports companies moving in that direction or experimenting in that direction without taking too much risk? And also, since you've been a councillor since the 90s, how have you seen Stroud change in terms of turning from what it was and into this semi-green utopia for green business ideas?
Well, it's quite a lot in there. I just want to pick up on something that Guy said about his attitude. One of the things I do know in Stroud is there's a lot of individual entrepreneurs and sort of, and I know all of them reasonably well, Dale and Claire and various other people. They're all incredibly driven people. And being driven, sometimes they forget about everybody else. Sometimes it's quite an interesting when you sometimes have to stand back. I mean, being a councillor is quite a challenge because local authorities are just slow and grinding and, you know, procedure and everything else. And you do have to just bang away on certain things. And I suppose the one thing I have done in Stroud and we have done in Stroud is we have got, you know, green policies into our purchasing policy, our audit policy, our corporate plan, all these sort of documents. But what it does mean is that there is that ethos moving into the council. So when the council, you know, employs people, it does try and go for local businesses, and it does go for sustainable business as much as we can under the Treaty of Rome. So I think, and having that credible people with deep ethics, but also knowledge and ability to stick to your guns. And the council has changed over the years. I mean, when I was a councillor in the 90s, you know, I was told that I was a silly little green wanting all this sort of, all these ideals. But I mean, just recently, as the council was reviewing whether it was going to have what it was going to do with the heating system in its building, its main office is as a Grade 1 listed old mill building. Just a slight diversion. That's why I was really interested in what Deborah was saying, because Stroud was made on wool back in the sort of the medieval times. I mean, it's a wool town, and that's what sort of brought it in it with watermills. But we had an option of what we're going to do with our heating system, and we opted for, well, several Greens were really pushing that we should go with wood source heat pumps. We actually, it went through committee, and even, and financially, it doesn't really pay for itself, but it emits less carbon, and far less carbon than gas heating. And even the Conservatives went with us, and they said, we accept the finances, and but we're doing the right thing. And also the company that's doing it, we're working with a local company who are about 5 miles up the road from Ebley Mill. And I don't think that happened for 20, 30 years ago. You know, that wouldn't have been there. And it's that sort of, it takes time to change culture and people's views. I mean, I suppose one of the things in Stroud is that there's this slightly can-do attitude, and also people not wanting to deal with big banks. I mean, you mentioned the regenerative agriculture. I mean, the community agricultural product at Hawkwood, that went out for a community share offer. Stroud Brewery, a B Corp brewery, Greg went out for a community share offer, raised £300,000 in less than 2 weeks. The e-bike shop in Stroud, you know, slightly different, but they couldn't actually get a loan from a bank. So I said, go and talk to Greg, and he said, oh yeah, you do a share offer like that, and they raised their startup money like that. I mean, even Ecotricity has gone out for community bonds. So I think there's that sort of having that ethos in that, actually putting your local money into your local business. And although we haven't yet got the Southwest Regional Bank, Stroud District Council is one of the founder investors in a regional bank. And we had a presentation, and oh dear, the discussions we had with some of the councillors about, would we lose our money? And we say, well, no, we actually want to invest locally. And again, really interestingly, when it came to the vote, we actually got, and it was unanimous. Even some of these, you know, die-in-the-wool Tories who wouldn't normally, they thought there was these weird hippie stuff on banks, you know, and they actually went with it, which was really interesting. And it is that sort of change. It does take time to change things, and not everybody goes with it. And it's sort of embedding it into that culture, I think, it is really, it is the key, and it's changing minds over a long period of time. And so you've got that almost ethics of doing things.
Yeah, I think Natalie was saying, our Green Baroness, or Green peer in the House of Lords, was saying that one of her biggest allies in the agricultural bill, where we have agroecology and stuff like that, is I think it's the Duke of Wellington, who owns over half of England, and he's really into sustainable farming practices. And of course, maybe we suspect he's a conservative. I think he's obviously him and his kin have been in the House of Lords since the dawn of time, but but it's good to know that there are sort of unlikely allies in the most unlikely places.
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, it's intriguing politically. Stroud is unique in that it's the actual administration on the district council is a Labour, Green, Liberal, Democrat council, and we've been running it since 2012. The Labour Party, it's not allowed in the Labour Party rules, so technically it's not, but we don't worry about that. But it's really interesting in that some of the sort of green and sustainable issues that we push for, some parts of the Labour Party get it, but quite a lot don't, because they're frightened it'll affect jobs. But I think over time, lots of the Conservatives actually began to understand, you know, the stewardship of the earth very, very slowly. They're not the sort of the right-wing libertarians. They're sort of beginning to feel that. So there's some really interesting sort of cross-party thoughts on that. And it's also, if you're around long enough as a councillor, it gets into the officer culture as well. And that's really important, because local authorities, you know, that you've got the members, but it's the officers that do the administrative work. And a little example was that when we were being audited for one of these things, ISO 1400 or something like this, or EMAS, one of these sort of things that you have to do to get a badge and a tick. one of the auditors was talking to one of the officers and was really pressing them about one aspect of it, because they weren't saying it, where's your sort of sustainability plan? And then the auditor suddenly realized that it wasn't something special for that officer to do. That's just what you did in Stroud. You actually took account of the environment. You took account of buying locally. That was just normal, and it wasn't a special thing. I think that's one of the things that why Stroud has attracted people like that, because doing things partly collaboratively, doing things in a green way, looking at things differently, it attracts people in, because it becomes the norm. And people are frightened of, some people are frightened of being different, but also it's great to have that ability to go and talk to people who've got similar values and are looking at things in similar ways. Not saying that everybody gets on, and they certainly don't, and that's very, very true. But it's things like, I mean, it just one little. I had a meeting with the Chamber of Trade the other day, and we were talking about something. And the chair of the Chamber of Trade, there was a decision to be made, and he said, "I remember Simon saying a few years ago that saving the planet won't be the cheapest option." And they actually agreed to go with a slightly more expensive option because it was a more sustainable way. But it's that sort of continuous messaging that it's not always about profit. It's actually doing what is best for the people and the planet, and like the farmers market in Stroud, that sort of is an opportunity for people to sell. And they're unbelievably competitive with each other. I mean, they're absolutely cutthroat, but they're all doing sustainable things. And in the end, they do get on because they recognize that that's their business.
Yeah, and it becomes everyone's personal responsibility rather than, like you're saying, one person's job, when you start to normalize this political power of how we spend, even though there are the aspects of our governance and how they shape the way that our businesses function. But I think this also kind of relates to one of the other questions we wanted to ask, which is, we have allies in the most unlikely places, and obviously the majority of the land in England is owned by people who have owned the land for generations due to the way that we had a monarchy, which is different than how America, or as it's now known, runs. And these systems that allow these people to continue to own land and to continue to sort of benefit off the hierarchy, not to say that every person who owns land is a bad person or anything like that. That's not the direction of this. But how do you all think that reshaping business to go from this hierarchy into a sort of circular shape, and by experimenting with these new ways of doing business, which allow more access to people who maybe wouldn't be able to start their own business because they don't have the capital? How do you think that could change not only the color of business in terms of skin color, because obviously I think we're all white presenting people here, and also the sort of age groups in that you wouldn't have to be sort of in the latter or towards the latter half of your life. I suspect we're all over 30 here. So how could we sort of, how could the green economy change the face of diversity in every sense of the word, not just skin color, but also access in terms of disabilities, in terms of financial disparities, things like that. Margo, you had published a book by a regenerative farmer called Leah Penniman over in the US called SoFile Farms, and her project and book, Farming While Black, inspired a movement here in the UK called Land in Our Names, which the team will share in the chat. So you can kind of, I know it's a long-winded question, but how does it relate to each of your businesses in terms of changing the face of business in every sense of the word? Feel free to.
Yeah, well, I think in the case of Leah Penniman, that was, it means dedication to reach out to different communities. I mean, you have to make an effort, and in the case of Leah's, it was one editor who was determined to bring in a more diverse set of authors and to have, a foundational book in terms of the Black farming experience. So, that was we were very happy about how that book came about and the success it's had. But I think, especially as a very small company, you have to really dedicate yourself to that and go look for those voices. I mean, here we are in Vermont. It's a very white state. You know, I don't think it's just more or less happenstance that's happened. But I think, you know, it requires reaching out and having that as a priority. In terms of young people, I mean, there's a big movement now in terms of young people to get into farming and let's say value-added food. And, you know, I mean, we've been working with Sandor Katz back since 2003 and his series of books on fermentation. We like to make the links also between food and health, which I think is left out of the conversation a lot in terms of national, you know, conversation. Witness the pandemic, it's never really talked about how nutrition plays a role here and what good food means in terms of staying well. So I think making all those connections between agriculture, food, health, the environment over and over again, and encouraging people wherever they are. I mean, in the US, we have much more access to land for young people. So I think it's a more intractable problem in the UK. I don't know exactly how you solve it, but you know, I think there could be some experimentation of getting estates to commit to allowing some portion of their land to be used in a different way, to experiment with, you know, if there are carbon taxes or not. I don't even know if taxes is the right thing, but you know, showing how agriculture can be done in a different way, and of course supporting that with the right kind of subsidies, not the wrong kind of subsidies. So really trying to get an economic reward for doing the right thing on your land. I think a lot of people don't do the right thing because there's no reward for it. So they may be open to doing that, but again, I see that as a, you know, it's interesting in terms of our own farming books. We have a lot of homesteading books, and it's hard. They're not as popular in the UK because there's a sense you can't homestead in the UK. Like, it's very, very difficult to be able to get a piece of land and start farming on it. So.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on the land access issue here in the UK in an episode later this month. Thanks, Margo. Does anybody else want to comment on that? Guy, I'm sure you do.
Well, I do feel, I felt pretty gloomy 5 years ago about where is the next generation of farmers going to come from, and you know, the overall, the mega trend is definitely towards scale and specialisation, and you know, something that I regret quite deeply. But there is definitely an undercurrent now. I'd say every year, you know, the Oxford Real Farming Conference is that there's a phenomenal occurrence happens in January every year. Just down the road, they're all the suited farmers and land agents and accountants, and it's just wonderful to see so many women and so many young people. And I'm particularly encouraged by that. They're people. It used to be 10 years ago they didn't know their arse from their elbow. You know, they really were incompetent, and you almost wanted to discourage them from going into farming because they were going to fail. It's very different now. You know, the people who really do know what they're talking about, and they're people who you would want to give an opportunity to. And, you know, in my declining years, the money that I took from selling Riverford, I bought a little farm up the road, and we do run it like that. We have lots of people running their own businesses on the farm. And it's lovely to be a facilitator of these young people who are pursuing, you know, ideals, but also in a, you know, in a practical way. And I do think, you know, we do need to also include the more traditional, you know, farmers who, you know, let's face it, they do have the skills. There's something you learn from being born on a farm, the sort of practical knowledge of the soil and machinery, which is very difficult to acquire later in life. And Margo, it's definitely not impossible. You can do it as home study, but it's just a lot more. It's a lot more difficult. So I think bringing those, you know, the established people with the skills together with this new, you know, more imaginative, outward-looking people who are going to shake things up is where the future lies. In terms of inclusivity generally within business, we used to be known for all the freaks that we employed, and they really were quite an odd bunch. And as we became, you know, with almost 1,000 people now at Riverford, and that's something which I feel quite sad about. I employ in this new farm, you know, all my staff are people who have been sacked by Riverford. Because they're just, you know, they had an alcohol problem or a drug problem, or they didn't fit in whatever way. And those are the people, when we talk about inclusivity, it's not just about gender. God, that is so important. And race, you know, we are in a very white area here as well. It's also about just general, you know, including people who are excluded through, you know, they're having a bad past or a bad family or having been in jail or whatever. It's a lot to do with sort of class and education and so on. And to me, that feels in South Devon, those are the ones feel to me the issues that we need to be addressing alongside gender as well.
Yeah, and I think that's why community-led businesses are so important, because it's not just about the overall community here in England. It's about the people who are finding issues, upward mobility issues, so to speak, or inclusion issues in the area that we live, and that type of person or the people who are marginalized in our communities are different everywhere. Does anybody else want to touch on that before I let you all escape? I'm sorry for everyone who asked questions. We're sort of run out of time, but I'll try to sort of email these out and maybe we can answer some of them. There's one for you specifically, Guy, that asked if it's better to buy local and seasonal or not. And I know we were talking about this before. You can probably answer it in one word.
Better than local or seasonal or
transported from halfway around the world.
There's no simple answer. Like most green questions, there is really not a simple answer there. You know, you have to know the most environmental and social issues like this are incredibly complex. I can't give a simple answer to that catches everything. Sorry.
Yeah, I would suggest you go and read, is it Mike Berners-Lee's book, Are Bananas Bad For You, or whatever they are. And his other book, There's No Planet B. There's a lot of environmental audit in there. It's not simple.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's buy local, but if it's squashy and can be damaged, it's almost certainly air freighted. So, you know, if it's overseas, comes on a boat, maybe okay. It is complicated, I know.
And everything requires a certain level of nuance.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for this lively conversation. There were tons of questions, and thank you for everyone who got involved. And we will be doing another event next week, Wednesday at 6, which is our slot here at the Green Party, where we'll be talking about politics with a big P as it relates to work as a green issue. Thank you everyone. Wishing you all a beautiful day, and we will talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.